welcome to Parents Supporting Teachers. We are so excited to have you. And we have about 1 billion questions to get through and more that have been coming in, and I'm sure will be on chat. So do you want to just sort of introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself and
Sure, yeah,
why you're answering these questions?
Who are you? No, right? So I'm Dr. Katelyn Jetelina. I am an epidemiologist. I have a research lab with about I don't know, 10 staff at University of Texas Health Science Center School of Public Health. I also teach. I'm a professor of epidemiology, and I have recently, in the past 19 months, become a scientific communicator of all things public health, including COVID-19. I think you guys, Nicole and Jenna, found me because of a newsletter I put out every couple days on the evolving events of the pandemic. It's called Your Local Epidemiologist. It started off as an update, actually an email update to students and staff, which has grown into a reach of more than 100 million people across the world. And so it's just blown up. And it's fantastic. You know, I love doing this, and I'm happy to be here.
That was the joke, is
incredible.
Somebody was like, you should reach out to her and reach out to your local epidemiologist and see if she'll do it. I was like, she would never. She's like famous.
It's true.
So we are super excited. So just to everybody watching, we are trying to get to as many questions as humanly possible. We have the amazing Rachel is in the chat, and she's going to be doing some writing of questions and answers, and Martha is going to be translating in Spanish, and hopefully my dogs are not going to be barking too much. But let's just jump right in.
Let's do it. So both Jenna and I are parents. And of course, we want to keep, all of our children very safe, very healthy. And both of us have one child who can be vaccinated and who has been vaccinated. And we both also have one child who is not yet eligible for the vaccination. And we're really looking forward to that. I have an 8-year-old and Jenna has an almost 12-year-old. And while we're looking forward to it, right, while we're excited about the possibility and saw headlines today, we wanted to talk a little bit about, or we wanted to get sort of like a general sense from you is, how can we be certain that the vaccine is safe for the, for everybody, right, who's getting it, with an eye towards what might be coming up with the younger crew being eligible?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that this group is a bit at an advantage because there's already a couple billion people in the world vaccinated. So we're pretty confident in the safety in general with these vaccines. I think, this is the typical breakdown is we start with adults and we do age de-escalation trials. And so we checked it for 12 to 17-year-olds, and now it's going to be 5 to 11-year-olds, and then it's going to be 2 to 4. Anyways, you start decreasing a stepwise position. And there's really 2 reasons for that. One is to look at the dosage. So what dosage do we need? And then also to continue to look at the safety and the side effects for different age groups. This 5 to 11 trial, it started off as a phase 1, just like every other clinical trial, which tested about 115 volunteers aged 5 to 11 to check the dosage. So which dosage did we need? Once we had that dosage, and then we moved into phase 2 and phase 3, which has recruited 4,500 kids to look at those safety signals. And so far from Pfizer, I actually haven't seen the data yet. I don't think anyone has except the FDA today. But what they say is that it's very safe, and people will likely get side effects like we saw with the 16 to 25-year-olds. So very much looking forward to seeing that data. But we are optimistic that it will continue to be safe for this group.
Okay, awesome. I think, yeah, just as parents, there's so much fear, right? It's something that people feel is new. And I think we're hearing that a lot, that this is a new vaccine and that we couldn't possibly know the long-term effects because it's all so new. So if you could address sort of that.
Yeah,
idea.
sure. I hear that a lot, as you can imagine. You know what? I think a lot of people don't realize how far back this research actually started. We started mRNA research back in 1961, and been working on it and working on it and working on it. And the reason why we haven't gotten it until 2020 was because we couldn't figure out a way to get this vaccine to the cells. We couldn't figure out a way to get the mRNA, the instructions to the cells. And the reason why is because mRNA degrades really quickly. It degrades so quickly that we needed to figure out a vehicle to transport it. And we finally figured out that lipid nanoparticles, which are basically fat bubbles, can carry the mRNA very effectively. And that research has been started since the 1965s. And so during the pandemic, we married the two. We married the mRNA discovery with the fat bubble discovery, and it turned out to work fantastically. The other thing, so this research has been around for a long time. I don't think people also realize that we've actually already had clinical trials going on for other reasons before COVID. The first clinical trial of mRNA was in 2001. And then in 2014, we started cancer treatments actually using mRNA. And then influenza vaccines came in 2017 with clinical trials in mRNA. So it's been around a while, and we haven't seen any long-term effects of it. But, I think you're right. I think we have to acknowledge that we don't have long-term data for the COVID-19 vaccine, but we do know a whole lot about mRNA, and we do know a whole lot about the human body. And we don't have any biological plausibility. We don't have any reason to think that there are going to be long-lasting effects.
That's so cool. I didn't even know that like,
no one knows that.
Well, I guess that's what throws me all the time, right? Is that I think that the lack of information lends itself so nicely to conspiracy theories, and sort of the idea that when you don't have the correct information, you're just going to fill it in yourself. And
yeah, and that's not just a problem in the United States. That's actually a global problem. The WHO last year actually called it an infodemic, an epidemic that spreads faster and farther than even COVID-19 and is more dangerous. And I truly believe in that. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. One, we have a very polarized landscape in the United States. We also have a very scientific illiterate base. I say that in all respect, but we don't have enough STEM integrated into everyday lives. The other problem is that scientists aren't trained on how to speak in English to people. And so you have this disconnect between scientists and the community, and this communication gap widening and widening because of the polarized political landscape in the United States. And you're right. People start filling it with misinformation because they're anxious, they're fearful sometimes, and they don't know where to go for the information. And so they start trying to answer the questions themselves. And unfortunately, it has led to, I call it a pandemic of misinformation, that's resulted in suboptimal control of this pandemic.
Sorry, Nick, before we jump to the next thing, which I know is you, but I want to just to tack onto this, with the mRNA, one of the big things is that it alters your DNA. And, the way that we understand it is that it's more like it jumps in, gives the instructions, and is out of your body within 4 days. So I don't know if that's correct. But what I do feel pretty confident with is that it is not altering DNA. So can you just sort of clarify that?
That's absolutely right. So mRNA does not alter your DNA. It lacks 3 basic requirements that we need in order, if we wanted to change our DNA, which it's not going to. First, mRNA would need to enter the nucleus of your cell, that's where the DNA lives. But mRNA doesn't have a secret code. It's called nuclear access signal to even get in. Say it could get in if it had that signal, which it doesn't, then we would need to convert mRNA to DNA, and we can't do that because we don't have another tool called reverse transcriptase. And then even that, if that happened, if it made it into the nucleus and it could insert it itself into the DNA, then we would need another tool called integrase. So it's just not going to happen. And we're very, very confident in that. And that is one of the earliest pieces of misinformation we saw on the vaccine front, and continues to concern quite a few folks in the United States. That was probably more than you wanted.
No, that was great. That was actually really helpful to know that what we have, we don't have the technology, we don't have the know-how, we don't have the ingredients to do something like that. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. Absolutely.
Great. We are not there yet, people. The future is not here yet. We are still working in the 21st century.
Well, I do want to say we do have DNA vaccines, not for COVID, but they are coming through. And so that'll be a whole nother wave of misinformation.
Oh my gosh. But this is not it. This is not it. This is not it. So in thinking about sort of the misinformation and sort of like the globalization of this pandemic and of COVID-19, and thinking about how, we really sort of as a world were a little slow on the uptake in terms of getting people the resources they needed to slow the pandemic down. And then we had the rise of Delta, right? For example, I think it came out of India, if I'm not mistaken, because they just got hit so hard without the necessary resources and assistance. And so eventually travels to us. And so I'm just thinking about what is the efficacy of this current vaccine if we know that there are going to be mutations and variations that are going to arise over time?
That's a really great question. So the efficacy for the vaccine for adolescents in the clinical trials was 100%. It was amazing. It blew our socks off, honestly. Our goal was 50%.
Can you say, what does that mean when you say efficacy? Because parents are listening right now and they're saying 100%. No. We know people who are vaccinated get COVID. So it can't be 100%. That's not true. So when you say efficacy, what do you mean?
Yeah, so that's risk reduction. So it's 100% effective in reducing risk of the COVID vaccine. And that was during the clinical trials. It's very important to note that the clinical trials isn't the real world, right? It's very controlled. It's randomized. We ensure everyone gets their second dose when and in the right conditions, et cetera. And so once it's out in the real world, efficacy usually changes a little. For example, in the adult trials, it was 95% efficacious in the clinical trials. In the real world, it was about 91% before Delta. Then Delta came, and Delta came at the same time of about 6 months to 8 months after our first vaccines. And together, those two have created a kind of a perfect storm of waning immunity. And what that means is that the effectiveness of our vaccines among certain people are starting to decrease slowly but surely. Now, they're still very good at protecting against hospitalization and death. What we're a little more concerned about is their effectiveness against mild to moderate disease. And that's where you start hearing about all these breakthrough cases, right? So these breakthrough cases aren't ending up in the hospital. If they are, it's very rare. But if you hear about a breakthrough case, you'll likely hear that it was a terrible flu, or, you know, someone caught it in asymptomatic testing or whatever. And so we're seeing a decrease of the efficacy, and that is really what called for the boosters last week among certain groups. We don't know, I know this is a bunch of parents and teachers, we don't know how efficacy is waning among adolescents. This booster was for 18 plus. I actually haven't seen any data for that in the United States of 12 to 18 or 12 to 17. And we can get in a whole conversation of why the United States has a terrible data system, but we don't know that yet. We think it will be coming. Now, what does that mean for mutations? So, you know, there may be a mutation that escapes our vaccines. For example, the mu variant that came out of Colombia can escape our vaccines. The more concern is, to me, the more concern is the rate of transmission right now. So every time that this virus jumps from person to person, it has the opportunity to mutate. And so right now on a global scale, it's mutating every 2 weeks. Now, sometimes it'll mutate for the worse, like we saw with Mu and with Delta. Sometimes it won't mutate for the worse. It's very random. But I don't want to bet on that. You know, I don't want us to rely on randomness to get us out of this pandemic. And so that is our number one goal right now, is to reduce transmission. So that's why it's important to wear masks, even if you're vaccinated. We don't want this thing, we want to stop spread at every corner. Because if we get a mutation, if we get a variant that mutates, that can escape our vaccines and is as transmissible or more transmissible than Delta, then we're going to be in a lot of trouble.
Is there any truth to, I mean, I sort of feel like this is our chance to like highlight sort of the rumors and dispute them. One of the things that I've been told is that the virus basically is competing with the vaccine. And so the more people we vaccinate, the more the virus will mutate in order to avoid or evade the vaccine.
Yeah, so I've seen that misinformation circulating around too. I think it started on LinkedIn from some screenshot or something, but there's actually just a study that came out maybe a month ago. I posted on my blog, but it showed that the countries with the highest vaccination rates have the lowest mutation rates, and vice versa. The countries with the highest mutation rates have the countries with the highest vaccination rates have the lowest mutation rates. And so we don't think that's happening. Now, that's not the entire story, right? You can have high vaccination rates with high transmission, like we see in the United States. You can also have high, and so that's not the whole story, but that's not the case. That may be the case if we only, if the majority of people only took 1 dose instead of 2 doses, but everyone's really completing their series, and so we're not worried about that aspect.
All right, I'm going to jump into the 5 to 11 vaccine. In terms, so we know this is we're approving in decreasing age order, right? And for this particular age group, there are some different factors, right? How is it going to interact with kids who have allergies? I know that we have a lot of parents whose kids have allergies and they're not able to get medical exemptions. We're wondering how these are going to interact with other vaccines. What if you have to get your MMR shot? What about concerns for kids with developmental delays? Will this have any impact on that?
Yeah, those are really good questions. Again, I haven't seen the data for 5 to 11-year-olds, but if we rely on what we've seen with adolescents, The anaphylaxis rates for PEG specifically are, it
What's
is
PEG?
poly something.
But like, what are you talking about when you say PEG?
Yeah, so there's an ingredient in the vaccine called PEG. It's an ingredient in the mRNA vaccines, and that is what is causing some anaphylactic shock among adults. Specifically, we saw in the beginning when we didn't know that. And so if your child has a allergic reaction to PEG, and they would know it, or have a conversation with their pediatrician, there's PEG in toothpaste, for example, that could be a concern. Your next question, but that's very rare, very rare. And
Right.
even there's new evidence showing that if you had a allergic reaction to the first shot, they should still get the second shot. So that's an interesting development.
And that's why they have you sitting for like a half hour afterwards, right? Because it happens right away. So you're not going to go home and have like an allergic reaction 3 weeks later.
That's absolutely correct. So yeah, so if you have a history of allergies, even, I don't know, egg or latex or whatever, any history of allergies, they'll make you sit there for 30 minutes. If you don't have a history of allergies, then you can go after 15 minutes. And that's why, is because this is very a sudden reaction if you're going to get it. And then, you have the trained staff there to help respond. But again, very rare. Your second question was about, what was it about?
I was jumping to too many things. The interactions with other vaccines,
interactions with other. So there's
flu, MMR, whatever it might be.
That's a good question. So in the beginning of the pandemic, we said, you have to wait for 2 weeks. And that's because we just didn't know, and we wanted to be extra careful. Since then, we know that this vaccine does not interact with other vaccines, mainly because there is a completely different biotechnology. It's teaching your body something different than, for example, the MMR vaccine or the flu vaccine is doing. So there's really no competing differences, if you may. And so we're actually even creating a vaccine that includes the flu, the RSV, and COVID shot right now. Moderna is doing it. And so very safe to do. Certainly, you don't have to wait in between doses. And then the third question you had with about developmental delays. Unfortunately, I haven't seen the data on this, but there hasn't been any signals in which that the vaccine would impact any kids in this category. In fact, some research has shown that they're at higher risk for COVID-19 disease. And so getting the vaccine is even more important.
So while we're talking about the vaccine and boosters, a couple people, I've already seen it floating around in the chat this evening and on the page. Clearly we have people who are catching COVID in Los Angeles and other places, younger people, children, older people. Can you talk a little bit about, when folks have had COVID recently, what is sort of the plan with getting the vaccine or getting a booster after you've had COVID? Does it mean that they can still get the booster and vaccine? Does that mean that they should wait? Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know that we're not supposed to, like I have a student in one of my classes today, we went to go get COVID tested and they reminded me, Pfefferman, I can't get tested because I had COVID and they had to like sit out of the line, right? So can you talk a little bit about how, the rate of transmission might impact sort of people's ability to get the COVID vaccine and booster?
Yeah, absolutely. You may hear my daughter in the background. Sorry about that. But yeah, so unfortunately, so natural infection, natural immunity works pretty well with some people. And we've seen that it can work for quite a long time. the challenge is we don't know who those people are. We don't have a good way to predict who they are. You know, sometimes it's asymptomatic people. Most of the times, if you're in the ICU, then you have pretty good antibodies that last long. But other than that, we really don't know the patterns. So because of that, we really have to treat everyone like they don't have protection. The other problem that we have is that the antibody test doesn't work. So if you got an antibody test, that only tells you antibodies. It doesn't tell you the back pocket protection like B cells or T cells. And so you don't know if you have, oh, sorry, my toddler is just driving me crazy. But
you're amongst your people. You're fine. we have all done all of this with yelling children in the background. Do not even worry.
Yeah, no. So anyways, you don't know if you have natural protection. We don't have a good test to tell you that. And we don't have reliable data to predict who has that. So right now, really everyone needs to get the vaccine or booster.
Okay, so even if you've had COVID, you need to get the vaccine, you need to get the booster when and if they're available for you, right? Because we want to make sure that everybody is covered and that we're not guessing here. Thank you.
And there's no, just to double clarify, so there's no like danger or anything that could be a problem if you had COVID and you get the vaccine. It's just extra protection. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's just extra protection. And actually, if you have COVID previously and you get the 2 vaccines, then it works even extra well. And so you actually have super protection. But again, we don't know who those people are. And so we really have to start from ground zero.
Somebody just asked in the chat really quickly, is there such a thing as too much, having too many antibodies floating around your system? No, we can just fill her up.
We can fill her. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, there's no problem with that.
I feel like it's like you can either have an umbrella or an umbrella and a raincoat, but either way, you really want to just be protected. So, all right. So the next question is somewhat specific, but it's going to apply to a lot of people, but it's definitely my personal. I have an 11-and-a-half-year-old. So he is going to be 12 in March. And I know that this question has come up a lot. So assuming that this emergency use authorization is going to come through, let's say this month, I'm going to have an 11-year-old. So the 11-year-old, the 5 to 11-year-old dose is 1/3 the dose of the adult of the 12 plus dose, right? So what would a parent do if they were in this situation? And then also, like, what if it overlaps? Do you get the 10 microgram, is it microgram? 10 microgram first dose and then a 30-second? Will the booster be, I mean, has this been discussed at all?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Now, a lot of people are under the assumption, a lot of parents are under the assumption that the dose is dependent on the weight, and that is incorrect. The dosage is dependent on the maturity of the immune system. Where I think it gets a little murky is where you're talking about where you're within 6 months of the birthday, for example. Now, I know that some pediatricians will give the larger dose within 6 months of that vaccine. And so that's really a conversation that you need to have, or someone needs to have with their pediatrician, because they know that the history of that patient, they know the risk benefit ratio, et cetera. And that should take care of if you have 1 dose and then a birthday is 2 weeks later and then they need a second dose. But certainly something to consider. Now, once you're outside of the 6 months, it's really best if you stick to the schedule that 11-year-old gets the 11-year-old vaccine and not the 12-year-old vaccine. It looks like even if it's a smaller dose, it has as good as an effect as the big dose for the older kids. And so it's working really well. Yeah, I mean, and so it's kind of a nuance, but important.
I think that that's super important to know, because like, I know for me, I remember looking at that like back of the Tylenol bottle and like the weight. And so I think as parents, we're like conditioned to use that as a measurement. And that's a lot of people were like, but my 11-year-old is larger than my 13-year-old. So what, you know, so it's good to know that it has to do with body development, and that's cool. Good to know.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, if we really want to get in the weeds, weight does have an impact on your immune system. And so weight has an indirect impact there, but it's certainly not like Tylenol, where it's certainly weight dependent. It's based on, again, the maturity of the immune system.
There's somebody who, sorry, just to piggyback off of the last question I asked. Yeah. So should people who have had COVID recently wait to get the vaccine at all, or can they just go ahead and get it once they're feeling like they can walk themselves to a pharmacy or walk themselves to a clinic?
Yeah, they should get it as early as 10 days after their first PCR positive. Now, they may have a little more severe side effects because your immune system will be able to recognize that. So they may get a fever if they didn't get one before, but it is safe, and it's certainly recommended. So and I wanted to go back. Sorry, Jenna. I remember about those vaccines, and you know, if an 11-year-old should wait to get a 12-year-old vaccine, and I certainly don't think that's the case. They should get a vaccine as soon as possible, given that the high level of transmission right now in the community.
I mean, that's definitely my instinct, but like I said, we're in this weird, like, I mean, literally he's going to be 11 3/4, you know? So to clarify, because we have somebody in the chat who was saying they were told by public health to wait on getting the vaccine after. So were you saying to wait 10 days? Did I misunderstand that? Or you're saying to not wait at all?
Yeah, so according to the CDC,
Sammy, if you want to clarify.
Yeah, no, so it's a common misconception. So according to the CDC, you just have to really wait those 10 days after your first PCR test. Now, there is some guidance out there that, you know, you can wait up to 90 days. And that's certainly true, you can. And the reason for that is because we know natural immunity works pretty well for 90 days across the board. And so, I mean, you can wait, but the earliest you can get it is that 10 days after.
So for example, here in Los Angeles, where we have now, you know, vaccines are going to be required for teachers in a couple weeks, and for adults on campus in a couple weeks. And then in January for students who are able to get it. So even if we get COVID between now and then, we need to go ahead and get ourselves the vaccine as soon as possible.
Yes, ma'am, that's right.
Thank you. So I guess
my mom
can I ask
a
question? Well, you gotta answer, Mrs. Schwartz.
Okay. I'm answering.
Okay.
You guys go ahead.
So I was just going to ask, because actually now that we're talking, I just sort of introduced this idea of the fact that LAUSD, second largest school district in America, has said that, you know, everybody who can get vaccinated on campus needs to be vaccinated on campus. You know, for adults on campus and for our athletes, our student athletes, it's going to be in just a couple of weeks. And then for, you know, students 12 and up, it's going to be in January. And, you know, we're hearing from folks, not just concerns about, you know, this misinformation and concerns around safety, but we're also hearing folks talking about how, you know, this is, you know, infringing on their right as a parent to make this choice for their child's body, right? For their child. Can you, and there are folks who are against this mandate. And so can you respond to that from, you know, your perspective as a medical professional and as somebody, you know, who's actively tracking this particular virus or wherever it is?
Yeah. So first of all, we're not going to get out of this pandemic until enough people are vaccinated, period. I think from the adult perspective, we've given almost 9-10 months of the carrot approach, and eventually, we really have to start pushing other people through the mandate approach. It seems to be the only way to get people to take this seriously with the vaccine. From the kid perspective, there's a ton of vaccines required for schools. In this, I'm in the state of Texas, but you're required, kids to enter kindergarten have to have 5 doses of Tdap. They have to have 4 doses of polio, 2 doses of MMR, 3 doses of Hep B, 2 doses of Hep A. I mean, I can go on and on. And so this isn't a new thing. The vaccines are incredibly safe. We haven't seen any safety signals after the 1 month, and that's when we typically see safety signals. I don't think you guys will be surprised that I fully support vaccine mandates.
Awesome.
I'm seeing this a lot in the chat right now, and we kind of addressed it earlier, but I want to really touch on this. So the question was, is it normal and okay for the CDC to approve a vaccine so soon? So I think that this goes along with the conversation about the emergency use authorization. So we're getting a lot of people who are like, you can't mandate this vaccine because it's emergency use only. And because it hasn't been studied enough, that's why it's not approved. So all of these sort of things that I'm sure you're familiar with, if you could just address that.
Yeah, so I touched on this a little before, but we got the vaccine very fast. It was record time. We got it in 9 months. But I think there's a very important distinction between rushed and speed. First of all, there were decades of research before this. A lot of people also don't realize how many people flooded the clinical trials and volunteered to be a part of this. Typically, it's really hard to recruit for clinical trials, and that wasn't the case. And so we had, I think it's over 600,000 people volunteer in the United States. And because of that, we were able to get it. The other reason we got this really fast is scientists didn't have money restraints. They were kind of just given it and could just take it and run. That is not, I'm a researcher, that is not the case. It usually takes years to convince people to fund my research. And so the other thing is we were able to start producing the vaccine at the same time as the clinical trials. And so what that meant was that the governments were really putting a bet that these vaccines would work, and they ended up working great. And so, we got the vaccine really quickly, but that's because a ton of research was leveraged and a ton of volunteers and money and time. This has also been a global effort. We relied on clinical trial data from Portugal, from Spain, for example. And then you brought up the EUA. So the EUA is fairly new. It was implemented, I think, in 2010 with the anthrax issue. Anyways, so we have an EUA. And so you're able to do that when there's a significant threat to the American people. And an EUA, what that means is that you only need 2 months of follow-up data to get the vaccine authorized. But that is under the assumption that the vaccine sponsors, so like Pfizer, would apply for full approval once they have 6 months or more of data. And so we've already seen that process go through. It's already, starting to go through right now with 5 to 11-year-olds. And so that's the small but important distinction between the two routes. There's nothing else different. It goes through 2 external committees. It goes through the FDA, it goes through the CDC. It goes through a lot of people's eyes before it gets to arms. And so, anyways, I think that answered your question. Okay.
No, for sure. I mean, I want to, without like sort of, beating a dead horse, like I do want to acknowledge that, like, even though obviously Nicole and I are very openly, I hate to say like pro-vaccine because it not like we're pro-vaccine, we're pro ending this pandemic, because oh my God, I'm so tired of it. And I am so like devastated, and we are just, we're done, right? And whatever we can do from a science-based perspective, it's just heartbreaking to see all of the information being shared for whatever reason. Like I'm always just confused. Like, why do you think people are out to get you? Like, it just at a base level, right? Like, I just like to assume the good and assume that people are trying to help each other, and it just makes me stressed. But anyway, I digressed, as I do. But I do want to ask you about, because I know that this is rooted in truth, that there have been instances where women's menstrual cycles have been disrupted. And I know for, like I have a 13-year-old daughter, and for especially the 5 to 11, like the younger kids, I know that that's something that's been coming up a lot. And then in addition to that, the myocarditis for male adolescents. So we'll touch on the female and then the male.
So the menstrual cycles, that seems to be a true signal, like you said. It's not considered a safety signal, though. A lot of people don't realize how complex the immune system is. The immune system touches on almost every organ, and that includes the lining of the uterus. And so what this looks like it's happening is that, just like you would get a fever or body aches as a response to the vaccine as a side effect, it's impacting some menstrual cycles. It seems to be short term. And certainly doesn't impact impact fertility. But I do know that researchers are looking at it and trying to estimate how often this truly does happen, because it wasn't tracked in the clinical trials.
And what about the myocarditis for
really fast before we jump to that? Was it not tracked because it didn't happen, or was it not tracked because
they just weren't? Because women are always ignored.
No, honestly, you laugh. It's the truth.
I'm being serious.
Yeah. So clinical trials actually has a really long history of not doing a good job studying women in research studies. We actually have no idea how, even certain medications impact female biology, like some drugs or even other diseases. Now, I know there's national initiatives to improve this, but unfortunately, it wasn't the case in the COVID trial.
We're a work in progress. I don't know why we should be, but we're amazing.
And so then the myocarditis. So myocarditis is a true safety signal. So that was a safety signal that was detected about 3-4 weeks after we started rollout of the vaccines. We did not see that in the clinical trials, and we didn't see that because it's actually incredibly rare. It happens in, I think it's about 25 adolescent males out of every 1 million vaccinated. And so we can't have a large enough clinical trial to ever detect that rare of an instance, but it seems to be a true signal. Now, what that means is that, the vaccine seems to be causing this, and it's mild myocarditis. And so no one has died in the United States from it. And we actually just got a really important study come out, 2 or 3 weeks ago, saying that those that are hospitalized for myocarditis after the vaccine fully recover, which is really important. And so what that means from a parent perspective is, how, and from a CDC and FDA, is we need to weigh the risks of possibly getting myocarditis to the benefits of what a vaccine provides. A lot of the conversation in this vaccine-induced myocarditis completely ignores the fact that COVID, the disease, causes myocarditis at an incredibly high rate, actually, and a lot more severe. So there's that. There's the possibility of a kid going to the hospital. There's a lot. And so part of the discussions, even with the booster trial or booster shot we saw last week, is continuing to monitor the data, continuing to make sure that the benefits greatly outweigh the risks. And they completely do. That doesn't mean that some won't get myocarditis, but that means it'll save a whole lot more more adolescents as well. And we need to continue to weigh that.
And you also don't know that if you get myocarditis from the vaccine, you have no idea what would have happened if you would have gotten COVID. So, right. So and I realize sort of like a major question that we never asked, which I feel like we probably should have led with, and I'm laughing at us now. Kids don't really get COVID, right? I think the constant refrain, right? Like what do they say, 0.002% of kids will get sick from, or it's like some like really small number, which, when that's still a lot of kids because we're a really big country. But also, like, what does that even mean? Is that true? And what is the definition of mild COVID? Because I think that I learned that the definition of mild COVID is not what we as parents might think is a mild illness.
Yeah, so COVID's certainly real for kids. I think that the danger that a lot of people have been doing is comparing it to adults, that COVID is less severe for kids than adults. It's very weird that it is. Typically, it's most severe for the kids and the older populations, but we got really lucky with COVID. And the danger is comparing that, right? That the rate of hospitalization is lower, the rate of death is lower than adults, and that's very true. I think the important context is, though, that kids aren't supposed to die. Kids very rarely die, and kids very rarely end up at the hospital. And so what you have to do is compare COVID to other leading causes of death for kids. And when you do that, COVID-19 is the leading cause of death for kids. There's no question about it. And so
really?
Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely.
Wow.
And so we lose that. Second, on an individual level is long COVID. So we're not entirely sure what the true prevalence is for long COVID among kids. Some research has shown that it's 0. Some research has shown that it's 40%. So somewhere in the middle is the true rate. I think the UK estimates it to be 7 to 8% among kids. And that seems low, but it's high enough that they're even in the UK creating long COVID clinics for kids. It's going to be a significant morbidity and in years to come. And then and so that's the individual level. And I wouldn't be an epidemiologist if I didn't bring up the population level. Kids are incredibly great transmitters of COVID. Even if they're asymptomatic, they have the same viral load as adults. And so they spread it as well, or if not more than adults. And so there's no way we're getting out of this pandemic unless we help stop the transmission among kids. And so that's really an important aspect too. And to, keep kids out of the hospital. I think, like you said, Jenna, 1% of kids get hospitalized that get COVID. Now, there's 30 million kids that are susceptible to COVID right now. And so that number starts adding up real quick. We only have 6,600 pediatric ICU beds in the entire country. And so I think we remember maybe through PTSD of what flatten the curve is. We certainly need to do that with kids right now because we are getting very nervous about the winter season coming up as well with RSV and flu.
So this actually touches on two things that I wanted to ask about, and somebody just asked, what does the long COVID look like in children and adolescents? And then also, as we're facing down the winter months, I mean, I'm a high school teacher and I get terribly ill at least once a year right? And it's somewhere around sort of like late winter that it normally happens for me. As we're staring down these fall and winter months, what is that going to be? So two things, like one, long-term COVID in kids, and two, winter is coming.
Winter is coming, Jon Snow. Long COVID is a whole range of things. And that's why actually it's been really hard and difficult to measure. It can be, pretty minor to headaches. It can be pretty major to fog, to brain fog. It can, some people never get their smell back. They don't get their taste back. What we're seeing in the adult populations right now is long COVID is causing brain tissue to decrease. And so we're worried about what that means for Alzheimer's in 20, 30 years among the general population. So there's a very wide range of what long COVID is. And again, making it very difficult to measure, especially among kids, where it's hard to have a baseline that like adults have. And then your question about, winter is coming, and we're actually, as epidemiologists, very nervous about this. Outside of a pandemic, first of all, coronaviruses are seasonal. They come in waves. And so we think that last winter's wave, it wasn't a coincidence that our highest wave was during the winter. And so we don't know what this will mean for COVID-19 this winter. The other thing that is coming is flu. I think we saw a really great preview of what this will look like with RSV this summer. It was out of control. And the reason for that is because the last year, there was no exposure to the flu. There's a lot of kids that have never been exposed, especially those that are less than 1 year old, like my little girl. And so that's where it's most dangerous. And so it's really important to get that flu shot. And the other reason we don't really know what's going to happen with winter is usually we rely on the Southern Hemisphere, Australia. Australia had zero flu season because they're on lockdown because of COVID. And so we don't even know what that'll look like. So I don't know. I don't think we should talk to an epidemiologist to get an optimistic view of the winter, but we'll see. And I think, again, protecting our health systems and our healthcare workers so they don't have a compassion fatigue is our number one priority.
I think that's a huge part of it also, right? Like, we're not just keeping our community members safe from COVID and keeping our community members out of the hospital. We want to make sure that someone who gets into a car accident has a hospital bed available to them and a doctor available to treat them and a ventilator if they need one. I think that is also, we need to be mindful. But I'm going to have to jump back really fast to when you said COVID is the number one killer of children right now. Like,
not number one killer, it's the top 10 killer. So it's a top 10 leading cause of death for kids.
For illness, or are we including all death?
We're including all. So we're including motorcycle accidents.
A little bit mind blown right now. So I mean, this is like when you talk to people, and Nicole and I have been fortunate enough to have had a lot of people reach out to us with their vaccine knowledge, and I was being sarcastic about that. Just wanted to clarify. I knew you knew that, but I was clarifying for the folks at home. And that's one of the big things is their children never die from COVID. So the fact that it's considered one of the top 10 killers of children right now, I think is a fact that is,
it's lost. And I think another comparison you can make, so the past year we had one pediatric flu death, and that was because of masks. Wow. So it's because we were staying at home. We had about 400 COVID deaths. And so that's an easy comparison of, a lot of people compare COVID to the flu, but COVID is more severe. And we just see that in the numbers. Now, I will say the majority of those that get severe disease among the kids seem to have comorbidities. They're obese. We're still on the fence about if asthma is a high risk. But so there's certain groups that are higher risk, but as a whole, yeah, it's a leading cause of death for kids.
My mom wants to know if you should get your antibodies checked and when she should get a flu shot.
She should get a flu shot in October.
Okay.
So flu shots, they also wane over time. They wane quicker for older people than for kids. And so it's a little more important to get the timing right for flu shots with older folks. Testing antibodies, you can't do it. Well, I mean, okay, you can. You may get a positive, which is great. It means you may have some sort of protection. If you have a negative, that doesn't mean you're not protected. Again, you have some back pocket protection like B cells and T cells that are just waiting to come in contact with the virus that won't show up on the test. So you can, but, and then a lot of people get a number on their antibody test, like 1,000. That number doesn't mean anything. If you get a 200 number, that doesn't mean anything. We don't know how that correlates to protection. And it seems that it's a lot more complex than just one number. So take
My
that
number
number
was
with a
so
grain of
high,
salt.
and now
Yeah.
I'm so sad. I was so proud of my number. I'm gonna get it on a t-shirt.
I was just going to say that, like, my parents who are older, and their circle of friends have been getting these tests, right? And stressing out about it or rejoicing in it. And it's like, it's a more complex picture than that, right? And it's sort of hard for us to like wrap our heads around that, like, it's not just black or white. There's like magic things happening in the human body that we don't maybe, that lay people like us generally don't understand or know. And that, we're still trying to work through as scientists in real time.
Yeah, it's extremely complex. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's been so difficult to communicate and so confusing for a lot of people, because it's incredibly complex. That science is under the microscope right now of the, jury of, civil opinion. And so it's been incredibly difficult and it's very complex. But I think people are hanging in there. I think people are still paying attention, and I still have some hope.
Yeah, I was telling Jenna earlier today in COVID testing line today, one of my student athletes who'd been, sort of reluctant to get the vaccine told me today, like, hey, Pfefferman, I'm making my appointment because, he wants to play basketball and he understands that, like, this is what he has to do to keep himself safe. And what he needs to do just to play, just to do the thing that he loves. So, we're chipping away. I do feel like we're chipping away.
Somebody wants to ask about erectile dysfunction affecting adults, and will it affect younger males?
So it does with COVID-19. If you get the disease, it affects it pretty bad. The vaccine doesn't have the impact.
Okay, so COVID, I think that's sort of like the overall concept, right? Anything that you may have as a potential side effect, you're likely going to have a much worse side effect from actual COVID. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely. Yeah.
I think like the other thing before we let you go, because I want to be respectful of your time, even though we could talk to you for 700 more hours. Like we've had a lot of people say that, the polio vaccine was researched for so X amount of years and but like that was in the 50s. And if we haven't learned enough over the last 70 years to be able to expedite and be smarter and use all of that knowledge to create bigger and better and faster vaccines, then isn't that sort of a problem with us if that isn't the case? I mean, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would obviously agree. I'm a scientist, but a lot of people try and make that comparison also with the 1918 flu. Hey, it wasn't as bad, but it was, we also we're decades away from, the technology and the medicine we have at our hands too. And this is, at this point, September 28th, 2021, this is a completely preventable disease, completely. From June to August, I think we had 250 preventable hospitalizations. And so, it's not like we don't have a solution. We have a fantastic, very safe solution right now. And unfortunately, politics and misinformation has really gotten in the way. And I think that that's a national tragedy. And once this pandemic ends, because it will, we really need to do some serious self-reflection on how to better prepare for the next pandemic, because there will be one coming, but we can respond much better.
I think that lends itself to like what we do as an education group, right? Like advocating for STEM, advocating for our kids and our students to have better access to information so that this doesn't keep happening. I cannot thank you enough. This was like the best night ever. Thank you.
Thanks
you
for having
so
me.
much.
Yeah.
Thank you. We really appreciate, you stepping away from your family and doing this with us and for our community. I know that, like Los Angeles parents and families appreciate this time that you've given us this evening.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
for you guys,
I'm from LA, so I'm happy to do this for my hometown. So absolutely.
And
Thanks
she's
for having
got
me.
two little ones at home, so she really is taking some time away. So thank you.
Good
and
luck
thank you
out
everyone for
there.
joining us. We're
Yeah,
gonna
stay
do
safe.
stay safe. We're gonna do a Q&A with a one-sheeter with all of these, especially because some other questions I think people came on later. So yeah, thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, have a good night. Bye.
You too.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.